Good morning. A warm welcome to all of you who are gathered here today. Your presence is a gift, and it allows us to draw deeper into loving and caring community with one another and with the God who made us all in the divine image. My name is Bill Rich, and it's my privilege and joy to serve as the interim rector here while Trinity searches for the 21st rector of the parish. And what a wonderful opportunity we have here together today as we gather for this, the fourth annual Anne Barry Bonneman Symposium. The overall mission of the symposium is to give Trinity a living platform for addressing systemic racism in our church and in the wider community. From the beginning, we have prayed that the symposium will help us by sustaining us with courage and strength to take concrete and meaningful actions towards the creation of a more profoundly anti-racist community here in the parish and beyond, as we anchor ourselves more deeply and thoroughly in the values of the Christian gospel. The symposium is funded through an endowment and through individual donations, and we are truly grateful to all of you whose generosity makes this symposium possible. The symposium is named for and honors the Reverend Anne Barry Bonneman, the former rector of Trinity Church, now retired, whose personal example, active commitment to social justice in its many forms, and passionate dedication to the eradication of racism inspired the founding of the symposium. It's a special joy and honor that we have Anne with us here this weekend, and I would like to invite you, Anne, to join me here at the podium so that we can express our joy and gratitude to you.
So much for your warm welcome. I'm honored to be here, and I'm very honored to have this symposium attached to my name. I think it's extraordinary, so thank you. I want to thank the planning committee for all their work, and choosing the topic of immigration could not be more timely. When you look at troops amassing on our borders in the face of a humanitarian refugee crisis, when you hear what's being said in the highest echelons of government, racist rhetoric, it's just time to talk about racism and immigration. And what I especially appreciate about this opportunity is that we're going to go below the sound bites and all the chatter in the news about this and really do thoughtful learning and reflection. So thank you for this opportunity. I look forward to learning. And I have to say that right now I'm so deeply moved by the art of Nora Valdez. And I've just done the tour of her art and ended up in the chapel, and it does visually what we're doing by heart and spirit today as well. So thank you for inviting me back. Thank you for creating the symposium and adding my name to it. And let's get busy. Let's get started. Thanks. Thank you.
As you know, the theme of this year's symposium is Love Thy Neighbor, Equity in Immigration. Immigration in America has provided opportunities for a wide variety of people to find new lives here and to contribute to the well-being of their new homeland. But in various times, including our own time, America's embrace of new citizens has been complicated by practices that have perpetuated white privilege and structural racism in virtually every aspect of our life: economic, political, social, and religious. Inspired and driven by the values of the gospel, the 2018 Bonneman Symposium will help us to explore ways to resist unjust immigration policies and to support the most humane approaches to immigration. Today, through speakers and discussion groups, we want to explore how people of faith and allies of goodwill can find ways to welcome the stranger and move our country towards becoming a more perfect union. Those of us who are Christian or Jewish do this in part because we've been commanded to do so by our God, who has said, I'm quoting from Leviticus, "When a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall do him or her no wrong. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." God moves us through words of Scripture to know the heart of the sojourner, but our hearts can also be moved through art to welcome the sojourner and to know that one's heart. As part of our symposium this year, as you already heard from Anne, we're blessed to have sculptures about the experiences of immigrants and refugees. Nora Valdez, an Argentine-born sculptor who now resides in Boston, has graciously allowed some of her work to be here for the symposium and for some time afterwards. Nora, will you please stand so that we can thank you? Nora uses sculpture and installations to create images that reflect on the nature of change and especially on forces that buffet our souls, be they natural forces or social ones. Nora's sculptures are in the chapel. That's the room directly all the way that direction, if you're not familiar with this building. The hallway that leads to the forum, that's this hallway out there to your left. And in the commons, that's the room in between us and the chapel. And in the narthex upstairs, that's the entryway into the church. Nora's own statement about her work is in your program, and I hope you'll look at that at some point this weekend. Before we move on to the introduction of our keynote speaker, let me make a few housekeeping announcements. In your program, you have the agenda for the 2 days of the symposium, today and tomorrow's events. I urge you to be here for as much of these days as you can, as the various strands of the symposium weave together in a beautiful and moving tapestry. After our keynote speaker today, there will be time for question and answer and then a break. And after that, there are breakout groups. The number for your breakout groups is in the upper right corner of your packet. So if you haven't figured that out yet, there's your number. There are greeters around the spaces to help direct you to various venues as we move from place to place. Look for them if you're confused and wonder, where the heck am I? For those of you not familiar with Trinity, there are bathrooms in 2 different areas. On either side of the chapel, and then again down this hallway to your left, you go to the foot of the stairs and turn right. There are bathrooms there as well. As in any public space, I invite you also to be aware of where the nearest exits are. There are exits here, as you can see from these red signs, as well as behind you. I feel like I'm on an airline, as well as behind you. But be aware so that we can all be safe together. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you the chairperson of the symposium planning team, Dr. Akindele Majikadumi. Akindele and his planning team have given themselves tirelessly to planning this symposium and its countless details and moving parts. We owe them a great debt of gratitude. Akindele, with great personal thanks to you and your planning team, I invite you to come to the podium and introduce our keynote speaker.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Bill. Good morning. I have the pleasure of introducing Mr. Ali Noorani to you all. Ali Noorani was born in California as a son of Pakistani parents. He graduated from UC Berkeley before coming to Boston, where he completed his master's in public health at Boston University. Mr. Noorani spent about 10 years in Boston serving residents of the Dorchester community as the director of the public health for both Dorchester House Multi-Service Center and Codman Square Health Center. These are 2 of the largest healthcare centers, not just in Dorchester, but in Boston. Mr. Noorani then became the executive director of Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition, also known as MIRA. Ali Noorani is a well-known figure and one of the nation's foremost on the topic of immigration. He has been featured on both conservative and liberal media outlets, including, but not limited to, Fox News. We still like him. MSNBC, CNN, ABC News, and many, many more. He has been featured on documentaries, including Papers, a story of undocumented youth and the challenges they face, and How Democracy Works Now, a 12-part documentary examining the American political system through the lens of immigration reform. And if these were not enough, Mr. Noorani also runs a regular podcast titled Only in America. I would encourage you all to check it out. In his daily work, Mr. Noorani is the executive director of the National Immigration Forum, a Washington, D.C. based immigration policy organization. Mr. Noorani has clearly demonstrated a commitment to immigration community and a commitment to building a bridge between immigrants and non-immigrants in the USA. It is with great pleasure that I have to introduce Mr. Ali Noorani.
Thank you so much, Kindle, and thank you very much to the planning committee, and thank you everybody for joining me on this spectacular, warm, dry fall in Boston. Boy, do I miss days like these. I was like very flinty when I was here. I could handle the winter, but then I moved to DC, and you're like warm in February. So, but thank you, thank you. I wanted to start this morning with a story. And the story is about a woman in California. She's a woman of deep faith, a woman who, with her husband, planted an evangelical church that has become one of the largest on the West Coast. Their belief in life and the sanctity of marriage underscores their conservative social values. About 10 to 12 years ago, they realized that their community was changing, that there were more Hispanics in their city coming to their church. So as servant leaders, they embarked on a new journey, the journey to welcome the stranger. Earlier this year, this woman, whose identity, if you don't mind, I'm going to protect, she participated in one of 27 living room conversations that we convened in suburban and rural communities across the country. We traveled to Carlsbad, California, DeKalb, Illinois, Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, Storm Lake, Iowa, Corpus Christi, Texas, Parker, Colorado, and even Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. We wanted to sit down and we wanted to listen to people's views on immigration in their communities. We talked with police chiefs, with religious leaders, military veterans, small business owners, immigrants, and refugees. And in these conversations, the first question that we asked was, we asked people to identify themselves and how they identified themselves. And this woman of faith told us, quote, "I'm very vanilla, very boring. Small business owners, conservative, Republican, Christian." And then we shifted these living room conversations to immigration and how they and their communities and families feel about a changing America. As her eyes welled with tears, this woman of faith who planted a church, again, that has become the spiritual home to thousands upon thousands. And she told us, "I can't have that conversation with my brother or my father about anything political without it becoming absolutely unbearable in seconds. Their understanding of immigration is so contrary to what I believe. They don't have any personal experience with it. They come from a white, middle-class perspective, and they don't want it to change." And she closed her answer with, "Their reaction is driven out of a sense of fear that they're going to lose their security or their identity." So think about this for a second. Because of the tension and the fear and the ugliness that is our nation's immigration debate, this woman of faith, could not talk to her own brother or father about this issue. That, I'm sad to say, is our new normal. The immigration debate has created a deep divide that I think we must reconcile. And this morning I am incredibly honored to be a part of the Ann Barry Bonneman Symposium. The leadership that everybody, not just in this room, but within Trinity Church, the compassion, the love for the stranger, I think is an important step towards reconciliation. So thank you. Through the dozens of living room conversations we convened earlier this year, we also heard that, yes, America is changing, and America is changing fast. And that it's in conservative America, our rural and suburban communities, that are experiencing the fastest and most profound cultural demographic transformation. These changes create fear, anxiety, and sadly, hatred. All of which pave the way for a political environment that's toxic in nature and tribal in practice. Sadly, if there's anything that our election this week has proven, it is that the polarization of our country is deeper and is sharper than we imagined. Americans do not trust each other, much less the media. And the othering of immigrants and refugees has a stranglehold on the nation's psyche. In this situation, we could look to our political leadership, we could look to our institutions, to each other, to our respective faiths, to find a common ground. Instead, our politics has overpowered our humanity, and we turn to our screen instead of our scripture. At the risk of oversimplifying, if we are politically liberal, the tribal drums of MSNBC shape our opinions. If we are politically conservative, our tribe is Fox News. Many Americans have been led to believe poor people are to be punished. There is no sense of the public good, no sense of the common interest. We've become a society that punishes instead of rewards. We're led to believe that is what is given to you is what is taken from me. And in this environment, it's easy for me to think that it's the other side of the immigration debate that is wrong, that is incorrect, that is dismissive, that doesn't respect people. In reality, what we've learned by working with communities across the country is that it's all of our responsibility to fix this situation. We're not curious about each other, therefore we do not respect each other. So, if I have one goal this morning, it is to leave you with a sense of curiosity. Because I think that if we are curious, if we listen, and on this seemingly intractable issue of immigration, if we listen to each other, if we respect each other, we can work towards a better approach on immigration. But our challenge, and this is really what I want to talk about, is that when it comes to immigration, I think we've been led to believe that we have a binary choice. That we can either be a nation of laws or a nation of grace. So I stand here today as the son of Pakistani immigrants who have achieved the fullness of the American dream to say that we can be both. In fact, we must be both. A nation of laws and a nation of grace. So how do we find this balance? Way back in 2011, which feels like, 18 lifetimes ago, the National Immigration Forum, the organization that I'm honored to run, embarked on our new strategy. We decided that we were going to get away from the toxicity of Washington, D.C. We were going to get out of the echo chamber of liberal America. We were going to focus our resources on the Southeast, the Midwest, and the Mountain West of the country to learn how conservative America was grappling with this issue of immigration. We were determined to meet people where they are, but we were also determined not to leave them there. And along the way, we came to learn that in these regions, if you hold a Bible, you wear a badge, or you own a business, more often than not, you want a common sense solution to the immigration system. So after years of working with and, much to my surprise, befriending leaders who are Southern Baptist pastors, Republican sheriffs, farmers, I've come to every day become more and more optimistic about the future of not just our country, but of this very, very difficult issue. But the challenge is, again, to rediscover this balance. And in order to do so, we need to understand the fears that Americans have when it comes to immigration. Based on research that we have commissioned in our work across the country, I believe the immigration debate leads to 3 fears in the minds of most Americans: culture, security, economy. Culturally, the question that many people have is, are immigrants and refugees, are they integrating or isolated? Are they living in their own enclaves, or are they becoming American and learning English? In terms of security, are immigrants and refugees threats or protectors? Are they here to do harm, or are they here to protect Americans and American values? And when it comes to the economy, the question that many people have is, are immigrants and refugees giving or taking? Are they giving back to the economy, or are they taking jobs and benefits? Culture, security, economy. These are the fears that the opponents of immigrants and immigration tap into. And these are the fears that in most cases are the fears that liberal America ignores. So if we don't see these as legitimate concerns, as legitimate fears that are intertwined in the minds of many Americans, we will never move forward. And more importantly, if we ignore these fears, well, we're just talking to ourselves. And I don't think we can afford to do that anymore. So let's unpack this a little bit. Let's start with the economic. Are immigrants giving or taking? The fact is that immigrants are not coming here for a free ride. They are coming to work, to contribute, and just like every other parent in our nation, they're coming to make sure that their child can thrive. In Massachusetts in 2015, 1 in 5 workers was foreign-born, 20% of the state's workforce. Healthcare, manufacturing, accommodations, and food services are the base state industries with the largest numbers of immigrants. And in 2014, immigrant-led households in the state paid over $6.5 billion in federal taxes and $3 billion in state and local taxes. Undocumented immigrants in Massachusetts paid an estimated $184 million in taxes and state and local taxes in 2014, and their contribution would have risen to $240 million if we were to pass immigration reform to legalize their status. And finally, in Massachusetts, over 68,000 immigrant business owners accounted for 20% of all self-employed residents in 2015, generating $2.1 billion in business income. Instinctively, I think most all of us in this room know this. We understand that immigrants economically contribute to the state of Massachusetts, much less the country. So let's get out of our comfort zone, if you will, and travel to rural America, where the isolation is greatest and the demographic changes are the fastest, and the administration's immigration agenda is strongly supported. According to the Pew Research Center, since the turn of the century, the population has declined in 52% of rural counties across the country. Among the hardest hit counties are the counties that depend on farming. Young people are moving out of rural towns to pursue jobs and careers in the big cities. As a result, from the grower to the dairyman, all who are ready and willing to pay a good wage, there's a constant scramble for labor. For example, in southern Idaho, the third largest dairy industry in the nation, their unemployment rate is around 3%. So every single day, dairy farmers are scrambling to make sure that the cows that they have are milked the 3 times a day they need to be milked. This doesn't happen by magic. We see the same challenges on farms throughout New England and throughout the nation. And the challenge only looks worse when you look across the economy. Look, I could rattle off pages of statistics on the economic contributions of immigrants to the American economy, and I'm happy to talk about that later. And there is a very strong case to be made about the economic contributions of immigrants to rural America. But the fact is that chants of build the wall are based on much more than the economy. They're based on questions of security and culture that shake people to their emotional core. And these are the issues that create the fears that define our politics. In one sense, we need to help our fellow Americans see that immigrants are here to protect our nation. So, for example, between 1999 and 2010, about 80,000 immigrants joined the armed forces. About 24,000 immigrants were on active duty in 2012, and 5,000 joined every year. Approximately 511,000 foreign-born veterans of the U.S. Armed Forces live in the U.S. these days. I bet you didn't know this. 1 in 5 Medal of Honor recipients is an immigrant. So if immigrants are serving our nation as members of our armed forces, why are there as many as 11,800 military families now facing the possible deportation of a loved one? At a time when fewer native-born Americans than ever are willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for our country, we should be honoring those who enlist, not deporting their families. So what about sanctuary cities or abolish ICE? This is in so many ways drives the immigration debate, and kind of particularly around security. So over the last 5 years, we've worked with law enforcement across the country, with Republican sheriffs in Iowa to Fresno County in California to the commissioner of police here in Boston recently joined our law enforcement immigration task force. So based on the work that we've done with law enforcement across the nation, this is what I can tell you. I don't want to live in a sanctuary city. I want to live in a safe city. And that city is a city where every cop on the corner can fulfill his or her oath to serve and protect everybody in their community. And the only way they can do that is to not be seen as an agent of immigration enforcement. So don't abolish ICE, hold them accountable. Make sure they aren't running roughshod over American citizens and immigrants alike, but make sure that cop on the corner is not taking on immigration enforcement responsibilities. That's how we keep our communities safe. And just as importantly, that is how we have a conversation with Americans who don't live in the big cities, who don't have these experiences. But once they see this language of sanctuary cities, abolish ICE, what does that lead them to assume? Lawlessness. But we can achieve the same policy goals with a language that brings people in. And I completely understand the immigrant community's desire for sanctuary and safety. I absolutely understand that. It is a terrifying time to be an immigrant in this nation. We have to find this balance. And let's not forget about the border. To be clear, I believe that we need a strong and secure border that keeps us safe. And, well, smart border security depends on a risk-based approach, not just great slogans. So I don't think a border wall is a smart investment of taxpayer dollars. I'd rather spend our money and time at ports of entry, where the majority of drugs, guns, and money are smuggled. If we want to be smart about border security, we increase the technology, manpower, and infrastructure at ports of entry so that, yes, trade, tourism, and migration is facilitated, and the smuggling of drugs, guns, and money is ended. And when we're speaking of the border, we need to remember that it's perfectly legal for a man or woman or child to present themselves to the U.S. Border Patrol agent anywhere along the border and ask for asylum. It's perfectly legal. Should they be found to have a credible fear that is a significant possibility that they will be prosecuted or has a well-founded fear of persecution, they have been persecuted, they will have been, let me try that again. There's a lot of P's in persecuted, feels like, right? Should they be found to have a credible fear that there is a significant possibility that they would be persecuted or has a well-founded fear of persecution should they return, they have the right to go through the asylum process and have their case heard by an immigration judge that can make a decision free of politics. Turning away asylum applicants before applying this credible fear test, assuming gang violence is not persecution based on a social group in nations where rule of law is crumbling, or even worse, taking a parent's child away from them in order to coerce their self-deportation, does absolutely nothing to keep us safe. In fact, when America is seen behaving in this manner, the cartels, the gangsters, the perpetrators of violence around the world see in America operating at their level, a nation that has lost its moral compass. So I think we'd all agree that America is better than the separation of families. So let's turn to the question of culture. In essence, our hearts, the place where all emotion, positive or negative, finds a home. As a result of what I've learned from pastors and religious leaders across the country, I've come to believe that it's the church and the diversity of our nation's religions who are going to ultimately bring us to a place of reconciliation when it comes to immigration. So let me share 3 examples. First, let's go to Salt Lake City in spring of 2016. It is the Mormon Church's biannual general conference where over 20,000 gather in an auditorium in Salt Lake and millions watch around the world. The theme for that Saturday afternoon was migration, or more specifically, the role of the LDS Church in welcoming and resettling refugees. Elder Patrick Caron came to the podium and began with, "For I was hungered, and you gave me meat. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in." As he came to his call to action, Elder Caron couched his message in the community's understanding of their own history. He said, "As members of the church, as a people, we don't have to look back far in our history to reflect on times when we were refugees, violently driven from homes and farms over and over again." As he spoke, Elder Caron's voice remained calm and his hands moved ever so slightly, making the sermon feel as big and as warm as this massive auditorium. His closing words served as a spiritual confrontation to the global audience he addressed, and he said, Being a refugee may be a defining moment in the lives of those who are refugees, but being a refugee does not define them. Like countless thousands before them, this will be a period, we hope a short period, in their lives. Some of them will go on to be Nobel laureates, public servants, physicians, scientists, musicians, artists, religious leaders, and contributors in other fields. Indeed, many of them were these things before they lost everything. He said, "This moment does not define them, but our response will help define us." Elder Kieran's challenge to the Mormon community to look beyond political tribalism spoke to their shared history, their culture and values as a Mormon community. And more than that, it was a curiosity and respect for their own journey as well as the journey of others. And this, if you'll allow me, is what I see this morning here at Trinity Church in Boston. Our nation's immigration system is currently designed, works actively against poor people and people of color. It is in this room where the work begins to change the system. And it's your response to the heated immigration debate that defines you as people of goodwill at a time when people of goodwill are sorely needed. So let's travel to the Bible Belt. Dr. Russell Moore is president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. We also spoke in the spring of 16 as the immigration debate was getting wound up into the presidential election of that year. While the Mormon community was a collective identity that draws a rough parallel to today's migrant journey, for the most part, conservative white evangelicals have no such history to draw from. So without this communal story of migration, the power of cable news challenges the power of the pulpit. Survey after survey shows that white evangelicals are the least supportive of immigrants and immigration to the U.S. So the question is, how does the cultural framework of conservative Christianity lead to curiosity and respect for the immigrant and refugee? Dr. Moore told me, "As a Christian, my primary identity is not white Southerner. My primary identity is in Christ. So when I'm standing up for Hispanic immigrant communities or vulnerable Asian first-generation Americans, I'm not kind of crossing a boundary here. These are my people because these are brothers and sisters in Christ." Which is where global missions help churches engage and understand changing neighborhoods. Dr. Moore continued, "In churches that are really committed to global missions, the identity of the congregation develops a sense of international solidarity. So while there may not be a history of migration for white evangelicals, there's an increasing body of work and of experience that makes it a little easier for churches to welcome the stranger into their midst. And these experiences are finding their way into the nation's immigration debate. So remember earlier this year in the zero tolerance policy where the administration was separating children from their families. When this became clear, conservative evangelical leadership released a letter that read, "As evangelical Christians guided by the Bible, one of our core convictions is that God has established the family as the fundamental building block of society. The state should separate families only in the rarest of instances." And Dr. Moore was one of the lead signatories of that letter. In a matter of weeks, that letter was signed by over 500 conservative evangelical pastors across the country. A week later, over 12,000 individual congregants from evangelical churches signed that letter. About a week or two later, under pressure from his evangelical advisory board that saw what was happening in their community, the president rescinded the program. Now we can have a conversation of what rescinding that program means, but the fact is that he acted under pressure from white evangelical America, as well as millions and millions of other Americans across the country. At the Forum, we've seen this as we work with conservative congregations across the nation. The church proves itself as one of the key places where communities can come to understand and respect each other. From small, struggling churches in Logan, Indiana, to mega churches in suburban Houston, to rural Iowa, Hispanic and Anglo congregations are coming to know and respect each other through their shared beliefs, which slowly but surely creates the personal relationships that lessen the tension of the debate. But at the end of the day, for many Americans, this is a question of legality. It's a question of control. And there's a sense that the nation has lost control, that our border is, according to the president, being overrun, and that people just look or sound different. So how do we help Americans understand that migration is a natural and normal part of the American experience, or the human experience? Because who among us, if our children are starving, poor, threatened with violence, would not do everything in our power to make sure that they had a better life, even if that meant crossing a border to seek protection? Since April 2010, Archbishop Thomas Wenski has led the Archdiocese of Miami. He's a child of Polish immigrants who cut his pastoral teeth working with the Cuban and Haitian migrants of South Florida. Archbishop Wenski opened my eyes to a different way of discussing migration. In our conversation, he spoke of the difference between natural and positive law, explaining the difference between what is wrong because it violates natural, moral, or public principles, and what is wrong because it's been deemed so in statute. And remember, he speaks to a conservative, very, very socially and politically conservative audience. A few weeks after we spoke, Archbishop Wenski delivered the homily at Red Mass at the Basilica of St. Mary Star of the Sea in Key West. The tradition of the Catholic Church since the 13th century, the Red Mass is celebrated to recognize the work performed by the judiciary and members of the bar. In his homily, he confronted the fear sweeping across the American politic, and he said, "We sense that our country and our culture is indeed undergoing a transformation that is as unprecedented as it is unpredictable. Implicit in this change of an age is a crisis of values and a crisis of leadership. And behind the anger and frustration of many people is simply fear." To his audience of policymakers and lawyers, Archbishop Wenski put the fear coursing through the nation in the context of the immigration debate. And he said, quote, "Illegal immigrants are criminals only because government policy declares them to be or treats them as such. In the same way that persons openly practicing Christianity or Judaism in Soviet Russia were criminals only because government policy declared them to be. And conversely, if government policy determines that something is legal like abortion, then the current conventional wisdom is that if it's legal, it can't be wrong." What Archbishop Wenski led me to realize is that to move is one of the most natural things that we do as human beings. Whether it's moving to another neighborhood, city, or country, moving is a choice we make to seek a better life. The systemic racism of our nation's immigration system works to end this natural behavior instead of facilitating immigration through legal processes and a smart border, in a manner that balances legality with compassion. So nothing that I've said this morning is easy to discuss at a dinner table. Good luck with Thanksgiving next week. Workplace or neighborhood meeting. And we could see these fears as completely insurmountable, intractable challenges that can only be overcome through politics and through political power. But the world isn't that simple, and America is not that progressive. From experience, I know that Massachusetts isn't even that progressive, right? The world is complicated. The world is on the move, and America is sincerely struggling with this question. So I don't think our job is necessarily to make the case to our neighbors and our families and our colleagues that immigrants and immigration are a benefit to the American worker and their families. Our job is to invite our fellow Bay Staters, our fellow Americans who live outside of the big cities into a conversation about immigrants and immigration. We're not litigating a case here, litigating an argument. We're inviting a dialogue. We can share the complicated story of immigration, why people migrate, through our own stories. Because when it comes to immigration, we actually all have a story. To put it another way, if we want to help immigrants, we need to help our fellow Americans understand immigrants. Press and politicians in Washington, D.C. call the challenges we face an immigration crisis. It's like a daily headline, right? Which just exacerbates the sense of fear, whether it's economic, security, or cultural. But this is not a crisis. This is an opportunity. The American public has been presented with an incredibly clear choice. As a nation, do we value immigrants and immigration? And what we learned through our living room conversations is that we need to work together across age, race, faith, gender, and yes, politics, to provide a new choice to Americans. We learned that most Americans want to see enforcement of a strong border, along with compassionate treatment of women and children seeking asylum. They want to see dreamers protected from deportation. They want to see MS-13 eradicated. They want to see new businesses launched by hardworking immigrants. Very few Americans want to see children put into massive detention facilities, callously separated from their mothers and fathers. Very few Americans want to see their undocumented friends, neighbors deported. Most Americans believe immigrants are protecting America and American values, giving back to our economy, and ultimately becoming American themselves. In Carlsbad, California, we heard that individual freedom and immigrants demonstrate a deep sense of commitment, responsibility, and duty. They want to, quote, pull themselves up by their bootstraps to make it work in their new home. In Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, we heard that immigrants work. They do what it takes. They put their heads down and get the job done. In Spartanburg, South Carolina, a dreamer, one of the folks who came to the U.S. at a young age, undocumented, and faces possible deportation should DACA be removed. She said she would, quote, remain in America, even if she's deported. This young woman had a powerful and emotional connection to the ideals of being an American, even in fact, technically she is not. And in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, we heard about their appreciation and gratitude for the helping hand, the overwhelming belief in God to shape and correct a life, the idea of the church as an entry point for getting to know people who are different. There's a lot of things to build on out there, but this is a moment in history when it feels like the world is shrinking, when lines on paper become a map, when information, goods, money cross those lines, when people cross those lines, when migration brings people who don't look or sound like us to our doorsteps. And with each change, the boundaries that compartmentalize our sense of place, they shift. What was far away is next door. Our assumption of what is possible, what our threats, has changed. And we get scared. We think that we are going to be refugees in our own nation. Therefore, we look to build obstacles in order to preserve our way of life. Then we realize that change can be slowed, but it cannot be stopped, which just scares us more. America, if not the world, Boston, is at such a point in history. The speed and clarity of what is broadcast to our phones has shrunk our world. We see the photo of the child on the train, the family on a raft, and we believe they will be our neighbors next week. It doesn't mean that we're not compassionate. It doesn't mean that we want people, that child on a train, that family in a raft, to lose their life, to be hurt. We don't want people to die at the hands of their tormentors. We don't want children to go hungry. And through our children, therefore, through our churches, our dinner tables, we take individual acts of compassion or grace. And through these individual acts, through these personal experiences, we come to the love, the Maria or the Muhammad that we know. But the global pressures of immigration undermine our trust in systems, so we remain fearful of the Maria or the Muhammad that we don't know. In short, our individual choices lead to compassion, but our fear of the unknown leads us to build an immigration system that is tough, that is strong, that is mean. In this national context, facing the challenges we face, I've been thinking a lot about the reconciliation of America. Can seemingly opposing beliefs be compatible with each other? Can America be a nation of laws and a nation of grace? What I've come to believe is that the reconciliation of America goes far beyond an individual act of grace. It will mean that each of us needs to rebuild trust at, yes, the individual level, but also at the systemic level, by inviting people into the conversations as citizens, congregants, and neighbors. So I have to think that in between the tribalism of cable news, underneath the grenades lobbed across our Twitter feeds, Americans believe that they are better than what they see on their screens. They know their fears of migration are creating chaos and division. And that is why this is not a crisis, it's an opportunity. I'm going to go back to that room in California and share the one quote from another woman in the room. And she's a child of immigrants. And she said something that sticks in my mind. And she said, "I'm proud to be an American, but I'm not sure America is proud of me." And that is our challenge. And that is our opportunity. Because together we can make an America that is just, an America that is good. Thank you.
Ali, thank you for that message. So this is going to start the question and answer portion of this. So please kind of get your questions ready. Since I have the mic, I'll take the liberty of asking them personally. Your message is a very, very good message, and
There's a bun coming here, isn't there?
no, I think no. What charge do you give the city dwellers?
Mm-hmm.
You know, here we are. You know, we're not in rural Idaho. How do we fit in the equation of bringing this process along?
Well, yeah, I think it really comes down to the difference between making a case and inviting a dialogue. And I mean, really, like, this morning, as I was kind of thinking about this morning, was the first time I had really thought about that difference. And I think that, you know, Boston, the leadership that's in this room, Trinity Church, coming out of the symposium, how are you inviting this dialogue, whether it's with, you know, partners in Framingham and Worcester, New Bedford, the North Shore. We know that other parts of the state are struggling with this question just as much as, you know, rural Idaho. So I don't think we have to go very far to invite people into this conversation. And I just think that it's a subtle but very important difference in mindset of, you know, making a case and inviting a conversation. Next question.
Hi. It struck me early on, you made a comment, something like, the changes are happening even faster in rural America than in cities. That surprises me. Maybe the fear is greater, but could you say more about that?
Yeah, sure. So when you when you look at the numbers at the growth in the foreign-born population, the fastest growth in the foreign-born population has actually happened in the Southeast, the Midwest, and the Mountain West. So in total numbers, it may not be, you know, the total number may not be great, but in terms of proportion, that's the biggest change. So you see, you know, we've seen this, like, there's a small town in Iowa, Storm Lake, Iowa. It's a town of, I want to say, 14,000 people. Their population, they're one of the few towns in the state of Iowa, in rural counties, that is growing. And they're growing because of immigration. The 14,000 people, you know, it doesn't take a lot of folks who are immigrants to kind of really change the makeup of that town. And they've been very successful because their mayor, their police chief, the entirety of their civic leadership from early on, and when they noticed this was happening, they said, you know what, we're going to be irrationally positive about this. I mean, we've done a lot of things there. They're cheerleaders. And you know who represents them in Congress? Steve King. Yeah. Steve King. Yeah. So they're growing and they're thriving, and they're managing this demographic change, and that's what's happening in these towns and cities, smaller towns.
Hi, so here's what I'm struggling with. One is, I think we do a disservice when we say people are searching for a better life. This is about survival right now. In Massachusetts, we have 15 people in sanctuary. We have networks of support in place to accompany people to court and raise money for bond and legal. And between today and early next week, I'll place 3 families in private homes that are seeking safety. The sense of urgency is intense. I'm struck by what I hear missing. So here's what I struggle with. Underneath all this, I think, is white supremacy culture. What we're seeing now played out is what we've seen in our communities of color for eons. And so I don't see it as a technocratic solution. We just have to find this. There's a level of cruelty that isn't addressed, and a sense of urgency. In Boston, the largest undocumented group are Irish. I've never gone to Burlington ICE or detention with a person who's Irish. They're all people of color. It feels like we are purging this country of black and brown people. And this sense of urgency, and it's life or death. It's not like, oh, you have to go to a smaller apartment. It's going back to places where you may die. And there have been deaths of people who've been deported. So I'm struck, like, I am responding to shut down ICE. You know, it used to be called Naturalization and Immigration Services. Now it's Immigration Customs Enforcement. The Burlington place is called the Enforcement Removal. So my question is, I think we do need a louder, strong, this is life or death urgency, and how do you respond to that?
So I would say, number one, that all the work that you just laid out, all the work that's happening in the immigrant rights community, all the work that the allies in this room are supporting is of absolute critical importance. Full stop. And it needs to continue, and it needs to be increasingly loud and make the public understand and hear it. Absolutely. And I will be the last person to say that that work should not take place. The challenge here is that in order for us to change the laws, because that is ultimately how this is going to be resolved. And we're going to have the crisis of the day, of the moment, of the morning, of the afternoon, of the evening, and we're going to fight and address each and every crisis. Absolutely. But in order for us to get, whether it is a state house, a Congress, to actually address this issue legislatively and achieve a legislative solution, we've got to figure out a way to bring along the rest of the country. So there's an organization out of the United Kingdom called More in Common. They've done a lot of really interesting research, both in Europe, but they recently completed a survey here in the States, and a survey of about 8,000 folks across the country. And what they found is that there are 7 tribes, and they didn't look at it as kind of right versus left, kind of Democrat versus liberal. They set up the research so that they started to develop an understanding of 7 tribes. And you have your wings, in essence. There's your devoted conservative, traditional conservative, and I want to say progressive activist. And the wings are set in their positions on most all issues, particularly on immigration. That's about 1/3 of the American population. 2/3 of the American population they categorize as the exhausted majority. Right? So right now everybody's just thinking, okay, well, am I the exhausted majority, or just exhausted, or right? So a lot of what we try to do as an organization is try to understand, okay, who are the folks in the exhausted majority? How are they going to engage in this conversation? Because some of them who are leaning a little more conservative, they're going to want to lead with security. But it doesn't mean that they are bad people. They're people who have fears. Some of the folks who are leaning a little bit to the traditional left, they're going to want to talk more and think more about this as an issue of fairness, equality, or rights. So for us as an organization who's ultimately trying to change policy, that's where we're trying to focus. And that is not to say that the work that's happening to address crises, to protect people, to make sure that immigrant families are safe is not important. In fact, it's to say that it's more important than ever.
Good morning. I listened to a talk show host out of Canada, but what he says probably applies here too. He says that immigration is crucial for the survival of the country because families not having enough children.
Right.
And it's more of a practical matter, that it's a crucial situation. I don't hear that very much on this side. I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I think 4 or 5 years ago, the issue of kind of declining birth rate, declining population, and therefore, who's going to pay for Social Security, I think it fell on deaf ears. I think that's slowly changing. We see more press about it. That question will come up more and more in suburban and rural areas. So it's absolutely an issue. I mean, long term as a country, there is pretty much, our ability for our economy to grow as we are actually creating more jobs and workers is almost impossible. And economists across the political spectrum realize that. But and this is kind of the challenge of immigration, is that people see the economic contribution of the person they work with from another country. They love going to that Afghani restaurant, right? But there's still something that's emotional that we have to help people unpack that gets them past the idea of, yes, I love the Maria that I work with, the Mohammed whose restaurant I go to, because I know them. But again, I'm still afraid of the people that I don't know. And that's not necessarily only an economic question. That's a question of culture and of security. And that's like I said, that's the challenging part about this. But I do think that the issue of the shrinking workforce, frankly, the shrinking country demographically, is becoming more and more salient.
Good morning, and thank you very much, and thank you, Reverend Bonnyman, for all that went behind the scenes to get to us here years later. My question is from the perspective of the anti-racism team here, where we talk about our internalized racial supremacy or our internalized racial oppression. And so I thank you especially because you have this soul of optimism.
It's hard to get out of bed otherwise doing this work.
Exactly. I appreciate that. And so you've worked with leaders and you've worked with immigrants face to face. And so you're inviting us to do the same. And I'm asking you, how do I do that and really manage my white supremacy or that internalized systemic place that I'm in because of who I am. I'm also, a daughter of immigrants who came after World War II, and I'm a green card holder now, so sometimes I worry, wow, am I going to be next? But I don't often worry because I think I have the advantage of being white. And so I'm asking the same question, but I'm really asking about when we invite that dialogue, how do you do it?
So I think there's two levels to this, and I mentioned this, kind of the individual and then the systemic. When I was writing in 2016, I was in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and I was meeting with the leadership of First Baptist Church in Spartanburg, one of the largest Southern Baptist churches in the state. And they were incredibly proud of their refugee resettlement program. And they were helping refugees from around the world, regardless of religion, resettle in Spartanburg. And they were doing the work within their congregation to manage the fears in a really incredible way. And I remember I was talking to, her name was Missy, and she was telling me a story of meeting a family on an overseas trip who used to live in the US. And the family said, I liked being an American, but I was never invited into an American's home. Yeah. And I've heard this over and over again in many other places, where churches often, there's this belief and a real pride in helping somebody, a refugee, resettle. But we don't necessarily take that extra step and say, you know what, come to my home. So that's, I think, a simple idea, just in terms of individual. And then I think at the systemic level, and this is really an institutional question, is who are the institutions outside of Boston that Trinity can develop a relationship with? And those institutions approach this issue in a different way. They may be, a different community organization or a church in another part of the state that is struggling with changes in their community. May just, be, a conversation with the city council in a different part of the state that is in the middle of the debate. I think from at an institution level, there's a lot of potential, and I think then kind of setting up the space and the opportunity to have a conversation, and as simple as it sounds, to kind of hear each other's fears and aspirations around this question.
I am an immigrant and been so for over 40 years. And actually, when I first came to the States, I went to Nashville, Tennessee, of all places. I had no idea, what it was like over there. But one of the key things, had to do with me being exposed, to a group of foreign individuals. White folks were foreign to me, just like I was foreign to them. And the key thing was overcoming the fear of the unknown. Of course, fear, appears to be the underlying emotion, that drives people to separate, and to put it in corners. And of course, fear, as you know, stands for false evidence appearing real. And in your work, is there any strategies, that you have thought about or that you have implemented, that appears to be the most effective strategies, to overcome fear? Because fear, of course, it is rooted in our innate self-preservation and survival of the fittest, mentality. So are there any strategies that, your group or other groups or you're aware of in research, that may have, been most effective to overcome fear?
Most of our strategy to overcome fear is really trying to understand, first of all, being okay with the idea that somebody's afraid. And I think for us as an organization, whether we are grappling with what we're going to say in any particular day in response to something, or doing our work day to day across the country, always, we have to just take the beat and say, okay, it is okay this person's afraid, right? Because if I don't understand, if I don't take that moment to try to understand and acknowledge and accept that fear, nothing we do is going to mitigate that fear. So that being said, we think that it's a combination of who is the person, that individual, who is the leadership that that person trusts. And for us, it is often, if we're working in a conservative community, it is their pastor or police chief, small business owner, a veteran that they know. That's the person that they will trust to have this conversation with. They're certainly not going to trust an advocate from Washington, D.C. I mean, I appreciate you all listening to me. But, so it's a matter of, again, acknowledging the fear, accepting it, and then trying to understand who will the community or the person that we're working with trust to have that conversation about the fear. And then from there, we can start to dive into what's the framework through which we have to have that conversation.
Thank you very much. This morning's presentation has all been oriented to the immigration question here within the United States. My question is the source and what the problems are. In the mid-1980s, 3 countries in Central America especially, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, experienced horrific levels of internal violence. It was part of the dirty wars. And they were so destabilized that 30 years later, the conditions are still existing. So my question is, how do we address, or can we address, the issues, especially in those 3 countries? Because people don't leave home in the face of minor difficulties. They leave in the face of violence and survival.
I think that is, I've worked in immigration since end of 2003. I think one of our biggest failings in the immigration advocacy space is that we have been completely incapable of answering that question. And I think most Americans, they're watching MSNBC or Fox, they see migration in a global context, but our organizations like ours, we only talk about it in a domestic context. And we've got to stop doing that. So I think that there are ways that we can start to have the conversation, because right now there are 65 million people forcibly displaced from their homes around the world. There are 265 million people on the move. Those numbers are going to continue to increase as we move forward. So global migration will continue to increase because of war, because of poverty, because of climate, and we've got to figure out an answer to this question. And those are the things that are happening now, much less the issues of 30 years ago. So what we've been trying to do is provide not just policy solutions around advocating for increased investment in home countries so that they can get back on their feet, but for example, in the case of Central America, establishing refugee processing centers in the region so that people can start the process nearby, but not necessarily have to take this very, very risky trip through Mexico. And then we're also trying to figure out, okay, how do we, in our case, work with law enforcement and the faith community, who often are very active in Latin and Central America. So for example, in Mexico, there's this amazing program that's a collaboration between state attorneys general in the US and their counterparts in Mexico, where AGs from the US are working with their counterparts to help them, in essence, strengthen their criminal justice program, which is great in 2 ways. One is that it bolsters the rule of law and safety for residents of Mexico and even in Central America in some cases. But second, it provides an experience for pretty conservative Republican state attorneys general to understand why people are moving. So now, for example, Greg Zeller, who was the Republican Attorney General of the state of Indiana, he recently joined our board. His experience, his point of entry experience on this was that program and also was Catholic upbringing. So we were always trying to kind of think about, we have to do a better job of thinking about these things in a global context, and there are some interesting programs that provide these experiences that just open up new doors.
We'll take 3 more questions.
Thank you. Your words about listening to what is said rang a bell with me when you described what the lady said about not being appreciated as an American. And my brain started to swirl. That has been a latent feeling for someone who came here in 1976. My education was paid for without any government contribution or any American contribution. My career soared. I've been here. But until you said that, then it rang for me. I have always had a feeling of really not being appreciated. I worked in 9 industries, represented America overseas, but never really felt appreciated. What were your thoughts as a strategy to help that lady and me and thousands of my compatriots?
We've stumped Ali Noorani.
I think that pride is a really, really, really tough emotion. Fear is easy, happiness is easy, but to be proud is really, really, it's a tough emotion to create. At an individual level or a personal level, I'm just speaking very personally, much less at a national level. So I think one of the things that we've done, I think that get to this place is early this year, when deferred action for childhood arrival was part of the legislative debate, we put together a number of like 2 or 3 minute videos. And we did them in conservative parts of the country, right? About DACA recipients and immigrants. But we did something different because oftentimes when you do these kinds of strategies, it's the immigrant who's saying, this is what I do, these are my contributions, da da da. In this case, we paired up the immigrant who's contributing, who's doing incredible things, with somebody who's been here for generations, with their pastor, their police chief, their business owner. And 2 things happened. One is the conversation that happened on screen was kind of magical, right? Because there's this really amazing back and forth between people and their experiences, and why the police chief of Houston, Art Acevedo, was so proud of this DACA recipient who had gone through one of his training programs. But the amazing thing that also happened is that we put these videos up again in kind of targeted states, focusing on conservative audiences, and they kind of went through the roof. They're viewed I want to say 4 or 5 million times. So I think that there is a way that we can help the American public, help ourselves, understand that we're connected through our stories, and that we can take pride in each other's story and each other's contributions without it feeling like something is being taken away. And I think that if there's an opportunity here for Trinity, is how do you tell that story that is here in downtown Boston in a way that resonates with, pick your conservative community in the state. So thank you for the question. Thank you.
So as I was struck by, in your first story, talking about that woman and her church who were built on, the words used were the sanctity of marriage. And that got me thinking about those immigrants whose families and loving relationships don't fit that deeply conservative model of the American family. Talking about LGBTQ immigrants, many of whom are fleeing countries that would kill them. Even actually recently, the spouses of diplomats to the UN were told that they are no longer welcome. And that's diplomats. So that's, the folks who are theoretically respected. So let alone what happens further down. So I'm wondering, that's how a lot of the rhetoric is couched, right? In the American family, these are, good, loving families. So how do we turn that rhetoric, if we are as you say, to appeal to this deeply conservative, deeply religious part of the American community. How do we shift that?
Yep. Thank you. I knew that when I opened my talk with that, it would be a challenge. And personally, every day that we do this work and we're working with and engaging and partnering and becoming allies and friends with communities that, we don't agree with personally, I don't agree with them on a whole lot of other things. And that's a question that I grapple with personally every day, and I know that many folks that work with me at the forum grapple with. I think that it comes down to the experiences that we create, and the experiences that the LGBT community has created for social conservatives to get to know the LGBTQ community. I think it's a strategy that those of us who work on immigrant rights can do a better job of advancing, because it's through those experiences where all of us are humanized. And what we try to do is really try to understand, okay, what is a person's assumptions, what's their framework, and then, like I said, meet them where they are, but do everything we can not to leave them there. And this is really, it's hard. It's hard on a lot of different levels. I try to personally approach this with a very, very high level of respect, because I may or may not agree with somebody that we're trying to work with on other issues or even on their immigration perspective at that moment. But I know that if I don't, and the organization that I work with doesn't approach people with respect, we're never going to be able to have a conversation of, okay, how do we move forward? And sometimes, particularly in this environment, that can take that requires a lot of deep breaths.
This will be a final question.
You guys ask tough questions.
I hope this won't be as tough.
Thank
you very much for your thoughts and remarks, and I very much appreciate the work that the forum's doing in terms of taking this, what I think of as a long view, and really sort of building a grassroots and a human connection. Incredibly important, and it really made me start thinking about some of my own activism and groups that I'm associated with, and how we could really connect, even within the Boston or greater Boston area. But I'm feeling the same angst or stress that the woman who spoke earlier. There's an urgency, there's an immediacy. We need immigration reform. We need to deal with these issues today. I'm part of a group that has a family in sanctuary, and part of the same network that she was mentioning. So I really appreciate the human connection. You mentioned there's the dialogue also with the institutional, and I appreciate the conversation you suggested, maybe reaching out to other communities of faith. How can we take that systemic, how can we address the systemic in the political arena? Not just, it'd be great for us to reach out to and talk to other communities of faith who maybe have or communities that have different views. But really, how do we kind of bridge that dialogue, and where do we begin systemically within the policy arena?
Yeah, that's, I have to say that, the pressure that Governor Baker has felt to separate himself from the administration's positions on these questions has been really, really helpful from the national perspective. So I think that the more pressure that Governor Baker, as a leading Republican figure in the country, feels that he cannot be a part of what the administration is advancing, that absolutely has a ripple effect across the country, and I think even across, just as importantly, probably the New England region. So I think focusing there. I do think, I haven't been following the State House work recently, and I see Representative Rushing back there. But what are the policies that can be moving through the State House? And I know in my time here, it's not as easy as people outside of Massachusetts think. So I would say, in the case of Massachusetts, focusing on the state. Pressure the governor, double down on legislative efforts in the State House, because those things they do have a ripple effect.
All right, I think there are a lot more questions and people that would want to kind of pick your brain. If we continue that process, we'd probably be here till the evening. So The next, what's going to happen next is we're going to take a short break, and then we're going to start our breakout sessions. If you look on your folder, on the right-hand corner of the top cover of your folder, maybe, if you look here, top right-hand corner, you'll see what breakout session group you're in. And then you can look inside the folder and you'll see where that breakout session will be meeting. So there will be a short break now, and then at 10:35 we will commence that. I would just like one more time for us to give Mr. Ali Noorani